down to his last $200 and living out of his pickup truck after losing everything in a devastating divorce and business failure, Ethan Caldwell made a desperate decision to buy an abandoned farm at a rural county auction that nobody else wanted. What he discovered hidden in the old well would not only change his life forever, but would uncover a Civil War mystery that had been waiting over 150 years to be solved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ethan stared at his bank account balance on his phone screen. 1,247.36x. The number seemed to mock him as he sat in the cab of his aging Ford F-150, parked at the back of a Walmart lot where he'd been sleeping for the past 3 weeks. At 38, he had never imagined his life would come to this. The rain drummed steadily on the roof, matching the rhythm of his sinking thoughts. Just 18 months ago, he had been a respected building contractor with a thriving business, a beautiful home in the suburbs of Charlotte, and what he thought was a solid marriage. Then the devastating 1-2 punch. His wife Melissa left him for his business partner, and within months, the construction company they had built together collapsed under accusations of fraudulent contracts. Schemes his partner had orchestrated without Ethan's knowledge. The legal bills alone had drained his savings. The divorce had taken the rest. His reputation in tatters. Ethan couldn't find work in any of the surrounding counties. Former friends and colleagues wouldn't return his calls. The mortgage company took his house, the bank repossessed his newer truck, and his credit was destroyed. All he had left was this old pickup, a duffel bag of clothes, his grandfather's pocket watch, and a rapidly dwindling bank balance. One more week, he muttered to himself, watching the rain form rivulets on the windshield. Maybe 2 if I skip some meals. After that, he'd have to swallow his pride and call his sister in Arizona, something he'd been avoiding because he couldn't bear to admit how completely he had failed. Scrolling through local news on his phone to distract himself from his hunger and the chill seeping through his bones, Ethan spotted an announcement that caught his eye. County auction, foreclosed and abandoned properties this Saturday. He had attended property auctions regularly in his former life, looking for renovation opportunities or land for new builds. It was a world he knew well, or had known. Curious, he tapped the link and scrolled through the listings. Most were foreclosed homes with starting bids well beyond his means, but one listing at the very bottom of the page stood out. Abandoned farm property, Harmons Creek, TN, minimum bid $1,000. The listing showed a dilapidated farmhouse on 15 acres, about 2 hours east of where he was currently parked. According to the description, the property had been abandoned for over 30 years and had serious structural issues. The county was eager to get it off their tax rolls and back into productive use. Ethan zoomed in on the photos. The 2-story farmhouse was in terrible shape, broken windows, missing roof sections, a partially collapsed porch. The outbuildings weren't any better. An old barn leaned precariously, and a small shed was almost completely overtaken by vegetation. But something about the place called to him. Perhaps it was the setting, nestled in a small valley with a creek running behind it, or maybe it was just that, for the first time in months, he saw something that was actually within his financial reach. Harmons Creek, he said aloud, testing the name. It sounded vaguely familiar, though he couldn't place. Why? He'd done some work in eastern Tennessee years ago, but couldn't recall ever visiting a place by that name. A quick online search revealed that Harmons Creek was a tiny, unincorporated community, barely a dot on the map, named after the small tributary that ran through it. During the Civil War, it had been the site of a minor skirmish between Union and Confederate forces, but otherwise had little historical significance. Today, it was home to fewer than 200 people, many of whom were descendants of the original settlers. Ethan checked the auction details again. The sale was scheduled for 10 a.m. Saturday, just 2 days away. If he drove out there, he'd be using precious gas he could barely afford. If he actually won the auction, he'd be spending nearly every cent he had left on a property that might be beyond salvation. It was madness to even consider it. And yet, what were his alternatives? Keep sleeping in his truck until his money ran out completely. The coming winter would make that increasingly dangerous. Try to find work in yet another county where his reputation hadn't preceded him. He'd already expanded his search in an ever-widening circle without success. At least with land and a structure, even one in poor condition, he'd have a place to stay, a base to rebuild from. With his construction background, he could potentially make repairs himself, given time and whatever materials he could scavenge or afford. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was all he had left. As dawn broke the next morning, Ethan made his decision. He would drive to Harmon's Creek, look at the property beforehand, and if it wasn't completely hopeless, he would bid at the auction. It might be foolish, but after months of paralysis and defeat, simply having a plan, any plan, felt like progress. He spent Friday driving to eastern Tennessee, the mountains rising around him as he headed east on I-40 before turning onto increasingly narrow and winding roads. The GPS signal faded in and out as he navigated through valleys where cell service was spotty at best. By late afternoon, he found himself on a gravel road with a faded sign welcoming him to Harmon's Creek, population 187. The town, if it could be called that, consisted of a small general store with a post office inside, a Baptist church, and a scattering of houses and mobile homes. Ethan stopped at the general store, hoping to get information about the auction property. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with a deeply lined face and alert eyes that sized Ethan up the moment he walked through the door. The bell above the entrance announced his arrival, making Ethan acutely conscious of being an outsider in this close-knit community. "Afternoon," the man said, his tone neutral but not unwelcoming. "Help you with something?" "I'm hoping to," Ethan replied, approaching the counter. "I'm looking for information about a property that's up for auction tomorrow, an old farm on about 15 acres. I believe it's off Route 9. The man's expression shifted subtly, his eyes narrowing. "You mean the old Winters place?" "I'm not sure. The county listing didn't mention a name. Has to be the Winters farm, only abandoned property around these parts. Been sitting empty since old man Winters died back in 91. The shopkeeper leaned forward slightly. "Mind if I ask what brings you to look at that particular piece of land? Not exactly prime real estate." Ethan hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about his situation. "I'm looking for a fresh start," he finally said. "Somewhere quiet to rebuild." The old man studied him for a long moment, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "Road you want is about 3 miles south of here. Turn left at the big oak with the lightning. Scar. Can't miss it." He paused, then added, "But mister, if you're looking for a fresh start, you might want to look somewhere else. That place has a history, some say a curse." "A curse?" Ethan couldn't help but smile slightly. "I'm not particularly superstitious," the shopkeeper shrugged. "Not talking about ghosts or haunts. Just bad luck follows that place like flies on manure. The Winters weren't the first family to abandon it, just the last." Ethan thanked the man for the directions and purchased a bottle of water and a granola bar, luxuries he could barely afford but needed after the long drive. As he turned to leave, the shopkeeper called after him. "Name's Bill Harmon, by the way. Family's been here since before the war between the states." There was something like a warning in his tone. "If you do end up with that place, come back and see me. There's things you ought to know." The ominous farewell followed Ethan as he drove the 3 miles south, found the lightning-scarred oak, and turned onto an overgrown dirt road nearly hidden by encroaching vegetation. The truck bounced and jolted over ruts and potholes, branches scraping against the windows as the road narrowed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Just as he was beginning to think he'd taken a wrong turn, the trees opened up to reveal a small valley, and there it was, the Winters farm. The reality was even more dilapidated than the photos had suggested. The farmhouse sat on a gentle rise, its white paint long since peeled away, windows like blind eyes staring out across fields reclaimed by nature. Behind it, the leaning barn seemed to defy gravity, while off to one side, Ethan could make out what appeared to be an old well with a partially collapsed stone wall surrounding it. Despite the property's sorry state, something about the setting struck Ethan as peaceful. The creek, presumably Harmon's Creek, glinted in the late afternoon sun as it wound its way along the edge of the property. The surrounding hills created a natural bowl, sheltering the farm from the worst of the weather. With work, a lot of work, it could be beautiful again. Ethan parked and got out, aware that he was technically trespassing, but reasonably confident no one would mind him inspecting the property before the auction. The air smelled of wild honeysuckle and damp earth. Birds called from the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drummed rhythmically against a tree trunk. The sounds of the city, sirens, traffic, construction, were noticeably absent, replaced by the gentle babble of the creek and the whisper of wind through the tall grass. As he approached the farmhouse, each step brought a flood of professional observations. The foundation appeared surprisingly solid despite the years of neglect. The roof needed complete replacement. Several windows were broken or missing entirely. The porch sagged dangerously on the right side, where a support beam had rotted through. Yet underneath the damage, Ethan could see the bones of a well-built home from another era. Hand-hewn beams, solid construction methods that had allowed it to stand despite decades of abandonment. The craftsmanship of a time when things were built to last. Standing on what remained of the porch, peering through a broken window, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on the irony of his situation. 5 years ago, he would have seen this property as an investment opportunity. Buy cheap, renovate, flip for profit. 2 years ago, he would have dismissed it outright as too much work for too little return. Now, it represented his last hope for shelter before winter. How had he fallen so far so fast? The construction company, Caldwell and Ross Building Contractors, had been his pride and joy. Started from nothing with just his tools and a second-hand truck, he'd built it into a respected regional business with 12 employees and a solid reputation for quality work. Dean Ross had come along later, bringing business connections and smooth-talking sales ability that complemented Ethan's hands-on building expertise. Melissa had been the one to suggest bringing Dean in as a partner. "He has the contacts we need to grow," she'd insisted. "And you can't keep doing everything yourself, Ethan. You need to learn to delegate." The memory still stung. His wife and business partner scheming behind his back, professionally and personally. By the time Ethan discovered the fraudulent contracts Dean had been arranging, cutting corners, using substandard materials, and pocketing the difference, it was too late. 3 major clients had already filed lawsuits. The business was drowning in legal trouble, and Melissa had already moved her things into Dean's lake house, taking half of what remained of their liquid assets. The legal battle had consumed the next year of Ethan's life. Though he was eventually cleared of direct involvement in the fraud, his professional reputation was destroyed. The legal fees had devoured his remaining savings, and the business declaring bankruptcy meant he was personally liable for loans he had guaranteed. The final blow came when he discovered Dean had emptied their business accounts and fled to Mexico with Melissa just before the indictments were issued. Ethan had tried to rebuild. He'd applied for construction jobs across 3 states, but in an industry built on reputation and word of mouth, no one would touch him. Former clients wouldn't return his calls. Former employees who had lost their jobs when the company collapsed spread stories, some true, some exaggerated, about his failure to detect the fraud happening under his nose. Pride had prevented him from seeking help from family or friends until it was too late. Until he was sleeping in his truck, surviving on fast food dollar menus, and watching his bank account dwindle day by day. And now here he stood, on the rotting porch of an abandoned farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, about to spend his last dollars on a desperate gamble. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown fields, Ethan returned to his truck. He would sleep there one more night, attend the auction in the morning, and then, what? If he won the bid, he'd own a dilapidated farm with no utilities, no running water, and barely enough money left for a few basic supplies. If he lost, or came to his senses and didn't bid at all, he'd be back where he started, but with fewer options and less time before winter. In the gathering darkness, with only the dashboard lights illuminating his weathered face, Ethan made his decision. Tomorrow he would make his stand. One way or another, his long fall from grace would end here, in this forgotten valley with its abandoned farm and whispered curses. The county courthouse in Morrisville, the nearest actual town to Harmon's Creek, was a modest brick building with white columns that had seen better days. Ethan arrived early, parking his truck in the nearly empty lot and checking his appearance in the rearview mirror. He had shaved in the gas station bathroom and put on his cleanest shirt, small efforts to look like someone who belonged at a property auction rather than a man who had slept in his vehicle for weeks. Inside, the auction was to be held in a small meeting room on the first floor. Plastic chairs had been arranged in rows, facing a podium where a county official would soon preside over the proceedings. Ethan took a seat near the back, noting with growing hope that attendance was sparse, just a handful of people, mostly older men who appeared to be local farmers or property speculators. He picked up an auction catalogue from a stack by the door, quickly flipping to the listing for the winter's farm. The printed description was even less detailed than the online version. Lot 7, abandoned farm property, 15.3 acres with structures, Harmon's Creek area. Significant deterioration, sold as is, minimum bid $1,000. As Ethan studied the catalogue, a man in his early 60s took the seat beside him. He wore a crisp button-down shirt and had the confident air of someone accustomed to these proceedings. "First auction?" the man asked, extending his hand. "Harold Wexler. I buy distressed properties throughout the region." "Ethan Caldwell," he replied, shaking the offered hand. "And yes, first time as a bidder. I used to attend them regularly in my previous life." Harold raised an eyebrow at the phrasing, but didn't pry. "Any particular property catch your eye?" Ethan hesitated, wary of revealing his interest to a potential competitor. "Just keeping my options open. You?" "I've got my eye on a couple of the commercial lots in town," Harold said, then lowered his voice. "Word of advice. Stay away from Lot 7. That old Winter's place is nothing but trouble. County's been trying to unload it for years." "What kind of trouble?" Ethan asked, trying to sound merely curious. "Drainage issues, soil contamination rumors from old agricultural chemicals, and the location's too remote to develop commercially." Harold shook his head. "I looked at it 3 years ago when they tried to auction it off at $5,000 minimum. Nobody bid then, and it's only deteriorated since." Before Ethan could respond, a woman at the podium called the room to order. The auction was beginning. The first 6 lots went quickly. 2 foreclosed homes, a small commercial building in town, and 3 vacant land parcels. Harold bid aggressively on the commercial property, winning it with a bid that seemed excessive to Ethan's trained eye. Then came Lot 7. The auctioneer, A county clerk with a monotone voice read the description with about as much enthusiasm as if she were reading a grocery list. Opening bid $1,000. Do I have 1,000? The room fell silent. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. $1,000? He called out, his voice steadier than he felt. A few heads turned, gazes ranging from curious to pitying. Harold gave him a sidelong glance that clearly said, "Your funeral." "I have $1,000, the auctioneer acknowledged. "Do I have 1,100? No response. 1,000 going once, going twice. 1,100. Called a voice from the front of the room. Ethan's stomach dropped. He leaned forward to see a middle-aged man in a suit holding up his bidder card. The man didn't turn around, but his posture radiated confidence. 1,200, Ethan counted, the words leaving his mouth before he could reconsider. 1,300, came the immediate response from the suited man. The back and forth continued with mounting tension. Each time Ethan bid, the mysterious competitor raised him by exactly $100. At 2,000, Ethan hesitated. He had planned to keep at least $200 in reserve for immediate supplies, tarps, tools, food. Going beyond, 2,000 would leave him dangerously close to broke, but the thought of returning to his truck with nothing, of continuing his aimless drifting until his money ran out completely, pushed him forward. 2,100, he said, his voice now betraying his strain. To his surprise, the suited man turned around. He was younger than Ethan had expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with sharp features and calculating eyes that assessed Ethan coolly. 2,200, the man counted, never breaking eye contact. Ethan swallowed hard. $2,200 would leave him with just 47 to 36. Barely enough for a tank of gas, let alone supplies. It was reckless, possibly suicidal as winter approached. Yet the alternative, walking away from his last chance at shelter, at a place to rebuild, seemed worse. 2,300, Ethan said, his voice almost a whisper. The suited man's eyes narrowed slightly. He seemed to be weighing something, making calculations beyond the mere dollar amount. Then, to Ethan's shock, he shook his head slightly and lowered his bidder card. 2,300 going once, the auctioneer called, her tone betraying mild surprise. Going twice, sold to bidder number 28 for $2,300. A mix of relief and terror washed over Ethan. He had done it. He now owned the abandoned Winters farm. He had also just committed every penny he had in the world, save for 4736, to a property that no one else wanted. As people shuffled out, following the auction's conclusion, the suited man approached Ethan. Up close, his expensive watch and the quality of his tailoring were apparent. "Daniel Garrett," he said, offering his hand. "Garrett Development Corporation." Ethan shook it warily. "Ethan Caldwell." "Well, Mr. Caldwell, you've just bought yourself a heap of trouble." There was something unreadable in Garrett's expression, not quite anger, not quite amusement. "If you decide you want to sell that property, and you will, give me a call." He handed Ethan a business card. "I'll give you 3,000 for it, sight unseen. That's a quick 700 profit for you." "Why would you offer that when you just refused to bid that amount?" Ethan asked, suspicious. Garrett smiled thinly. "Let's just say I didn't want to appear too eager in a public auction. Drives up prices unnecessarily." He tapped the card in Ethan's hand. "That offer expires in 30 days. After that, you're on your own with that money pit." As Garrett walked away, Ethan completed the purchase paperwork with the county clerk, writing out a check for nearly every cent he had. The clerk handed him a folder containing the deed, property records, and a set of keys that likely didn't match any functional locks on the long-abandoned property. "Congratulations," she said, though her tone suggested it was anything but cause for celebration. "Property. Taxes are due by December 31st. Ethan stared at her. "How much?" $342.16. She gave him a look that was almost sympathetic. Might want to start saving now. As he walked back to his truck, deed in hand and virtually penniless, Ethan tried to focus on the positive. He had shelter of sorts, land that was now legally his, a place to stand and fight rather than continuing his slow drift toward complete destitution. Yet Harold Wexler's warnings, Garrett's strange behavior, and Bill Harmon's mention of a curse nagged at him. What exactly had he gotten himself into? As he drove back toward Harmon's Creek and his new property, the cloudy sky opened up, rain pounding on the truck's roof and hood. It felt like an omen, though whether good or bad, Ethan couldn't decide. All he knew was that he had just made the most desperate gamble of his life, and there was no turning back now. The rain had transformed the dirt road leading to the farm into a slick, muddy challenge. Ethan's truck slipped and lurched over the increasingly treacherous surface, windshield wipers struggling against the downpour. Twice he nearly slid into the drainage ditch that ran alongside the road. By the time the farmhouse came into view, a gray silhouette through the sheets of rain. He was gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "Home, sweet home," he muttered grimly as he parked as close to the house as he dared, the ground around it turning into a quagmire of mud. Grabbing his duffel bag and the folder of property documents, Ethan made a dash for the porch. The rotting steps creaked ominously under his weight, and he found himself testing each board of the porch carefully before putting his full weight on it. The front door was swollen with moisture and required a solid shoulder push to open. It gave way suddenly, causing Ethan to stumble into the dark interior of what had once been a family home. The smell hit him immediately, a damp, musty odor of decay and abandonment, underlaid with hints of animal droppings and mold. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, the full reality of his purchase became painfully clear. The main floor consisted of what had once been a living room, dining room, and kitchen. Wallpaper hung in sad, mildewed strips from the walls. The wooden floorboards were warped in places where water had leaked through the compromised roof. A fieldstone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth littered with bird droppings and the remains of a raccoon's nest. The furniture, what remained of it, was in ruins. A sagging couch, its upholstery rotted and torn. A dining table with only 3 legs, the fourth apparently having served as firewood for some previous squatter. A cast-iron stove in the kitchen, so rusted it looked like it might crumble at a touch. Upstairs was no better. The staircase itself seemed questionable, several steps broken or missing entirely. Ethan tested each one carefully as he ascended. 3 bedrooms and a primitive bathroom comprised the second floor. In one bedroom, part of the ceiling had collapsed entirely, leaving the room exposed to the elements. Rain pattered directly onto the remains of an iron bed frame. The smallest bedroom was the only one that seemed relatively intact. Its roof had held, and while the window was broken, the interior was simply dusty rather than actively decaying. It would have to do for now. Returning downstairs, Ethan made a more thorough assessment. The house's structural bones were surprisingly sound, a testament to its 19th century construction. The foundation showed no significant cracks. The main support beams appeared solid despite surface damage. With proper repairs to the roof and extensive interior renovation, it could be functional again. Livable, even. But those repairs would require money he no longer had. Outside, the rain had slackened to a drizzle. Ethan explored the outbuildings with growing despair. The barn was even worse than the house, with one wall partially collapsed and extensive roof damage. Inside, he found the rusted hulk of an ancient tractor and various farming implements that might have been museum pieces. Nothing immediately useful. The small shed was more promising. Its sheet metal roof had protected the interior somewhat. Better. Inside were basic tools, a shovel, rake, axe, and handsaw, all rusted but potentially serviceable after some attention with steel, wool, and oil. Then there was the well. Positioned about 50 yards from the house, it was a traditional stone-lined structure with a wooden cover that had rotted through in places. Peering carefully over the edge, Ethan could see water about 20 feet down, reflecting what little daylight filtered into the shaft. At least he wouldn't die of thirst, assuming the water wasn't contaminated by agricultural runoff or whatever soil contamination Harold Wexler had mentioned. As dusk approached, Ethan faced the immediate problem of where to sleep. The house was too compromised to be safe, especially in the continuing rain. The barn might collapse entirely in a strong wind. That left his truck, again, a familiar discomfort at least. He climbed back into the cab, reclining the seat as far as it would go. The sound of rain on the metal roof was oddly soothing after the tension of the day. As physical and emotional exhaustion overtook him, one thought kept circling in his mind. Had he made the biggest mistake of his life, or somehow stumbled onto the path to redemption? Morning brought watery sunshine and a renewed sense of determination. Ethan awoke stiff and cold, but with a plan forming. The immediate priorities were clear: secure shelter, establish a water source, and figure out how to stretch his remaining 4736 until he could find some source of income. After a breakfast, consisting of his last granola bar and water from a bottle he'd refilled at the courthouse, Ethan set to work. First, he cleared the smallest upstairs bedroom of debris and dust, working carefully to avoid the boards that seemed compromised. Using a tarp he found in the shed and plastic sheeting from his truck's emergency kit, he covered the broken window and created a relatively dry sleeping space. Next came the well. Using the rusty tools from the shed, he cleared away the overgrown vegetation surrounding it and examined the stone structure more carefully. The stonework itself was impressive, each stone precisely fitted without mortar, creating a lined shaft that had endured for what must have been over a century. The wooden housing around the top needed complete replacement, but that could wait. More pressing was determining if the water was safe. With no way to test it properly, Ethan decided on a compromise. He would boil any water before drinking it, at least until he could afford a proper testing kit. The hand pump that must have once drawn water from the well was long gone. But Ethan fashioned a makeshift bucket from a plastic container he'd been using to store emergency supplies in his truck. Tied to a length of rope, it allowed him to draw water from the well, a laborious process but functional. With basic water access established, Ethan turned his attention to the fireplace. It would be his only source of heat as the weather grew colder. He cleared the debris and carefully examined the chimney for blockages or damage. Finding it relatively intact, he gathered fallen branches from around the property for firewood. It wasn't ideal. Green wood would smoke terribly, but it would have to do until he could acquire proper seasoned firewood. By late afternoon, he had created the barest essentials of survival: shelter, water, and heat. But the enormity of what still needed to be done was overwhelming. The roof required immediate attention before the next serious rainfall. The broken windows needed to be properly covered. The water from the well needed proper testing. And perhaps most pressingly, he needed food beyond the few supplies remaining in his truck. With just over $47 to his name and winter approaching, Ethan's situation remained precarious at best. As he built a small fire in the fireplace, its wavering light casting long shadows across the decaying interior of what was now his home, he contemplated his options. He could try to find day labor in Morrisville, though his truck was running dangerously low on gas. He could attempt to forage on his land, though his knowledge of edible wild plants was rudimentary at best. Or he could call the number on Daniel Garrett's card, accept the $3,000 offer, and walk away from this desperate gamble while he still could. But as he warmed his hands over the small fire he'd built, Something kept him from reaching for his phone. Perhaps it was stubborn pride, unwilling to admit defeat so quickly. Perhaps it was the small satisfaction of having created even these most basic comforts through his own efforts. Or perhaps it was the strange sense of connection he felt to this place, a sense he couldn't explain but couldn't deny either. Whatever the reason, as darkness fell on his first full day of ownership, Ethan Caldwell made another decision. He would give this place and himself at least a week before considering Garrett's offer. 1 week to see if the Winters farm held any promise at all, or if it truly was the cursed money pit everyone seemed to believe it was. Dawn broke clear and cold on Ethan's second day at the farm. Frost glittered on the overgrown fields, and his breath formed clouds in the chill air as he emerged from his makeshift bedroom. His back ached from sleeping on the hard floor, but he'd been warm enough thanks to the fire he'd maintained through most of the night, and his sleeping bag rated for cold weather, one of the few quality possessions he'd managed to keep. Today's agenda was clear, a systematic exploration of every inch of the property. If he was going to make this work, or even make an informed decision about whether to try, he needed to know exactly what he was dealing with. After a breakfast consisting of his last package of peanut butter crackers and well water he'd boiled the night before, Ethan began with the house itself. This time, his inspection was methodical and professional, drawing on years of construction experience. He checked every load-bearing wall, examined each floor joist he could access, and assessed every window and door frame. The news was mixed. The foundation was remarkably solid, built of local stone and apparently untouched by significant settling. The main framing of the house was constructed of old-growth timber that, where not damaged by water, remained stronger than most modern lumber. Original hardwood floors ran throughout, and beneath decades of grime, they appeared salvageable. But the challenges were enormous. The roof needed complete replacement. At least 40% of the rafters were compromised, and every inch of shingles needed to go. Most of the windows were broken. The plumbing, where it existed, was ancient cast iron that had likely cracked in numerous freezes and thaws. The electrical system was a dangerous patchwork of early knob and tube wiring with haphazard mid-century additions. Ethan kept a running mental tally of repair costs as he inspected, even doing all the labor himself and using the most economical materials. He was looking at thousands of dollars, money he simply didn't have. Moving outside, he began a careful survey of the land itself. The 15 acres consisted primarily of overgrown fields, a small woodlot at the back of the property, and the creek that defined the eastern boundary. As he walked the perimeter, Ethan was struck by the natural beauty of the setting. The surrounding hills created a sheltered valley with good southern exposure. The soil, where he could assess it, seemed rich. In what must have once been a kitchen garden near the house, perennial herbs had gone wild. Thyme, rosemary, and sage growing in fragrant tangles. Against all odds, he discovered an apple orchard that had somehow survived without pruning, the trees gnarled but still bearing small, tart fruit. He collected several apples, relieved to have found something edible on the property. The creek provided another pleasant surprise. Clean and swift-flowing, it widened into a small pool at one point that was teeming with small fish. With a proper fishing line, or even a makeshift one, this could be a reliable food source. Returning to the outbuildings, Ethan conducted a more thorough inventory. The barn, despite its structural issues, contained a wealth of old tools and equipment. Most were antiques, but many remained functional: hand planes, draw knives, augers, and other woodworking tools that didn't require electricity. There was even a foot-powered grinding wheel that, once cleaned and oiled, would allow him to sharpen the tools properly. In a forgotten corner, he discovered a cache of preserved glass canning jars, dusty but intact. The contents had long since spoiled, But the jars themselves, with their wire bales and glass lids, were still usable. If he could grow or forage food, these would be invaluable for preservation. By mid-afternoon, Ethan had reached the well again. On closer inspection, he noticed something odd about the stonework. Near the top, one large stone had a small symbol carved into it, a crude arrow pointing downward. It seemed intentional rather than a natural feature of the stone. Curious, Ethan examined the other stones around it. Nothing unusual presented itself immediately, but as he cleared more vegetation from around the well's base, he noticed that the ground on one side sounded slightly hollow when he tapped it with his boot. Intrigued, he fetched the shovel from the shed and began carefully removing the topsoil. About 18 inches down, his shovel clinked against something solid. Further excavation revealed a flat stone slab about 2 feet square. It took considerable effort to pry it up, but when he finally managed to lift it aside, Ethan found himself looking at a small chamber built into the ground beside the well. Inside was an old metal box, approximately the size of a large bread box, consumed by rust in places but still intact. The lock had long since corroded away, and with some careful manipulation, Ethan was able to open it. The contents were initially disappointing, what appeared to be old papers and fabric, all partially decayed from moisture that had seeped in over the years. But as he gently separated the deteriorating materials, his fingers touched something solid. Wrapped in the remains of an oilcloth was a heavy object that, when finally revealed, caused Ethan's breath to catch: a gold coin. Then another. And another. In total, the box contained 27 gold coins, each about the size of a modern half-dollar, but considerably heavier. They were American $20 gold pieces, double eagles, as Ethan vaguely recalled them being called. Most were dated from the 1850s, with the newest bearing the date 1862. Also in the box was a badly water-damaged diary, its pages stuck together and the ink badly faded. Only fragments were legible. Confederate patrol must hide the regiment's pay, return after the war. The last entry, barely readable, was dated April 1863. Ethan sat back on his heels, the coins laid out before him on the ground, glinting. In the afternoon sun, he had uncovered what appeared to be a hidden Civil War cache, Union Army payroll, perhaps, hidden from Confederate forces and never retrieved. The historical significance alone was considerable, but the potential monetary value was staggering. Even with his limited knowledge of collectible coins, Ethan knew that Civil War-era gold had both numismatic value beyond its gold content. These 27 coins could be worth tens of thousands of dollars, possibly much more to the right. Collector. Just like that, his desperate situation had been transformed. With this discovery, he could repair the house, pay the property taxes, and still have a substantial cushion. He could transform the farm into a viable home, possibly even a working agricultural property again. But as the initial shock wore off, questions began to surface. Who legally owned these coins? Would the discovery need to be reported to authorities? Could the government claim them as historically significant artifacts? What about the descendants of whoever had hidden them here over 150 years ago? The sun was beginning to lower in the sky as Ethan carefully returned the coins to their metal container. He needed time to think, to research his options, to make sure he didn't make any hasty decisions that might jeopardize this unexpected windfall. As he carried the box back to the house, the weight of it in his hands represented more than just gold. It was the weight of history, of moral questions, and of sudden, unexpected possibility. For the first time since his life had collapsed around him, Ethan felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. That night, by the light of the fire, he examined each coin more carefully. They were remarkably well preserved, protected by the oilcloth. And their underground chamber, the faces of liberty shone as clearly as the day they were minted, and the distinctive eagles on the reverse remained crisp and detailed. Ethan placed them carefully back in their container and hid it beneath a loose floorboard in his sleeping room. Tomorrow, he would need to make decisions about this discovery. But tonight, he allowed himself to imagine possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours before: a restored home, a productive farm, a new beginning built on the foundations of the past. As he drifted off to sleep, the irony wasn't lost on him. He had come to this abandoned property as a last, desperate gamble with his remaining $200. Now, buried treasure, the stuff of childhood fantasies, had potentially changed everything. The question that remained was, at what cost, and with what consequences? Morning found Ethan staring at the coins spread across the rough wooden floor of his makeshift bedroom. He had barely slept, his mind racing with questions and possibilities. In the clear light of day, the reality of his discovery seemed both more concrete and more surreal. The double eagles gleamed even in the modest sunlight filtering through his plastic-covered window. After careful examination, he had identified coins from 3 different mints: Philadelphia, San Francisco, and the rare New Orleans mint, whose coins commanded a premium among collectors. Most dated from 1853 to 1861, though a few were from 1862. Using his phone, the battery now precariously low with no way to charge it, Ethan conducted some basic research. What he found was staggering. Even the most common double eagles from that era were worth between $2,500 and $2,000 each for their gold content alone. The rarer specimens, particularly those from the New Orleans Mint, could fetch $5,000 to $10,000 or more in good condition. Some, depending on specific mint marks and rarity, might be worth considerably more to the right collector. Conservative estimates put the value of his find at $50,000 to $100,000. Potentially much more. But the question of rightful ownership plagued him. The fragmentary diary suggested these coins were Union Army payroll, hidden during the Civil War. Did that make them government property even after 150 years? Was there some statute of limitations on such finds? And what about the legal principle of finders keepers when it came to discoveries on his own land? With his phone battery dipping below 10%, Ethan made a decision. He needed more information before proceeding, and that meant a trip into town. He carefully rewrapped the coins. In the remains of the oilcloth, returned them to their metal box and secured it beneath the floorboard. Then, after a breakfast of wild apples, he headed to his truck. The drive to Harmon's Creek took only minutes. Bill Harmon's general store was open, its worn wooden sign creaking slightly in the morning breeze. A small bell announced Ethan's entry, and the old shopkeeper looked up from his newspaper with mild surprise. "Well, you're still here," Bill observed. "Thought you might have reconsidered after seeing the state of that place." "It needs work," Ethan admitted, "but it has potential. I actually came to ask about local history. You mentioned your family's been here since before the Civil War." Bill's eyebrows rose slightly. "Since 1838. My great-great-grandfather settled this valley. I'm curious about the battle that happened around here, the skirmish during the Civil War." Ethan kept his tone casual, conversational. "Wasn't much of a battle," Bill said, leaning against the counter. "More of an encounter. Union supply column got ambushed by a Confederate cavalry detachment in the spring of '63. About a dozen killed altogether. The Union boys retreated to the Winters farm, your farm, and held out there for a couple days until reinforcements came." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Why do you ask?" "Just trying to understand the history of my property," Ethan said, perhaps too quickly. "Also, I was wondering if there's any place around here I could charge my phone." I'm completely out of power. Bill pointed to an outlet near the register. Help yourself. While you're waiting, you might want to look at that. He handed Ethan a small book titled Harmon's Creek and the Civil War, a Local History, published by the County Historical Society. The amateur production had a grainy black-and-white photo of soldiers on its cover. Wrote it myself, Bill said with a touch of pride. Not much call for copies these days, but you can have that one on the house. Welcome to the community gift. Thank you, Ethan said, genuinely touched by the unexpected kindness. While his phone charged, Ethan paged through the slim volume. The section on the Winters farm confirmed what Bill had told him. It had served as a temporary Union stronghold. In April 1863, according to the book, the Union supply column had been carrying payroll for troops stationed in eastern Tennessee. But the historical record wasn't clear on whether the payroll had been captured by Confederate forces or successfully defended. One passage caught Ethan's eye. Local legend holds that Lieutenant Samuel Winters, owner of the farm at that time and a Union sympathizer, may have hidden the payroll somewhere on the property before the Confederate attack. Winters was killed in the skirmish, and his widow Sarah maintained until her death that the blood money was still hidden somewhere on the farm. No evidence of this payroll has ever been found, and most historians dismiss it as local folklore. Except Ethan now knew it wasn't just folklore. Find anything interesting? Bill asked, noticing Ethan's absorbed expression. It's fascinating, Ethan replied carefully. I had no idea the farm had such history. That's not even the half of it, Bill said. The Winters place has changed hands more times than any property in the county. Nobody seems to stay long. He lowered his voice slightly. Some say it's because of Sarah Winters's curse. Curse? Ethan asked, recalling their previous conversation. Story goes that after Samuel was killed, Sarah became bitter, blamed the gold for her husband's death. She supposedly cursed the farm, saying anyone who found the blood money and used it for themselves would meet a bad end. Bill shrugged. Just an old story, of course. Ethan felt a chill despite the warmth of the store. What happened to Sarah Winters afterward? Lived in that house alone for nearly 40 years, became something of a recluse. When she died in 1901, the property went to a nephew who sold it almost immediately. Bill eyed Ethan curiously. You really are interested in all this old history, aren't you? It helps to know the story of a place, Ethan said vaguely. By the way, do you know anything about a man named Daniel Garrett? He seems very interested in the property. Bill's expression hardened slightly. Garrett Development, been buying up land all through the county for the past few years. Word is they're planning some kind of resort complex along the Creek Valley. Offering good money, but most old-timers aren't selling. He paused. He approached you already. Made me an offer right after the auction, Ethan confirmed. Figures. Bill seemed unsurprised. That farm is the missing piece in his land assemblage. Property directly on both sides belongs to his corporation now. You might want to keep that in mind. Whatever he offered, the land's probably worth more to him than he's letting on. This new information added another layer to Ethan's already complicated situation. If Garrett wanted the land badly enough to approach him immediately after the auction, why had he stopped bidding? And what would he do if he knew about the gold coins? As his phone reached a workable charge, Ethan thanked Bill for his hospitality and the book. On his way out, he spotted a bulletin board with local job listings. One caught his eye. Experienced carpenter needed for barn repairs. Weekly pay. See Jim Mercer at Riverside Farm. Ethan jotted down the information. If he was going to stay and figure out the coin situation, he'd need income for essentials and materials. This could be the opportunity he needed. Driving back to the farm, his mind worked furiously. The historical context now made sense of his discovery. Union Army payroll hidden by Lieutenant Winters before the Confederate attack, never recovered after his death. The legal situation, however, remained murky. As he pulled up to the farmhouse, Ethan noticed something different. Tire tracks that weren't his own led partway down the drive before turning around. Someone had come to the property while he was gone. Alarm shot through him as he rushed to the house and up to his makeshift bedroom. Relief flooded through him when he found the floorboard undisturbed and the metal box still safely hidden with all 27 coins intact, but the tracks were concerning. Had Garrett or someone working for him come snooping around, or was it just a curious local wondering about the property's new owner? Either way, Ethan now faced 3 immediate challenges: securing his valuable discovery, establishing some source of income to survive, and determining what legal and ethical obligations came with finding what might be technically classified as a historical artifact or abandoned government property. As the day waned, he made himself a promise. Whatever happened with the coins, he would not let this second chance slip through his fingers. The Winters farm, with all its troubled history and potential curses, had offered him an unexpected lifeline. Now he needed to determine how to grasp it without being pulled under by forces he didn't yet fully understand. The strange tire tracks weighed on Ethan's mind as he secured the farmhouse as best he could before heading out to the riverside farm for a possible job. He had no illusions about the security of his hiding place if someone were determined to search the property thoroughly. The gold needed a better solution, and soon. Riverside Farm proved to be a well-maintained operation about 5 miles from Harmon's Creek. The property boasted large fields of hay, a modest herd of cattle, and several outbuildings in various states of repair. The main barn, however, was clearly in dire need of attention. Its roof sagged dangerously in the middle, and several support beams were visibly compromised. Jim Mercer, the owner, was a weathered man in his 60s with calloused hands and a no-nonsense demeanor. He eyed Ethan suspiciously as he approached. "You hear about the carpenter job?" he asked, not bothering with introductions. "Yes, sir," Ethan replied. "Ethan Caldwell. I have extensive experience in structural repairs and renovations." "You the fellow who bought the old Winters place?" Mercer's expression was unreadable. Word traveled fast in small communities. "That's right," Mercer grunted. "Need to see what you can do before I hire you. Barn roof's collapsing. Support beam cracked during that big storm last month. Need it replaced and reinforced before winter sets." "I can handle that," Ethan said with confidence. This was familiar territory, the kind of work he'd built his reputation on before everything fell apart. Pays $150 a day, cash. Materials provided, no benefits, no paperwork. Mercer gave him a pointed look. "That work for you? Under normal circumstances, Ethan would have balked at working under the table for such modest pay. But these weren't normal circumstances. $150 a day would allow him to buy essentials and begin accumulating materials for his own repairs. More importantly, it would be honest work, something he desperately needed for his self-respect. "When can I start?" he asked. "Tomorrow, 7 a.m. sharp. Bring your own tools if you got 'em." With that settled, Ethan returned to the Winters farm with a small measure of optimism. He now had potential income and a plan forming for how to address the gold coins. His construction background had taught him that sometimes the best hiding place was in plain sight, or rather, incorporated into a renovation where it wouldn't be discovered without tearing everything apart again. But first, he needed to thoroughly document his find. Using his phone's camera, he carefully photographed each coin individually from both sides, paying special attention to the mint marks and dates. Then he took several photos of the metal box, the location where he'd found it, and the remnants of the diary. If questions ever arose about the discovery, he wanted evidence of exactly how and where he'd found the cash. The diary fragments continued to intrigue him. Most of the text was indecipherable due to water damage, but he was able to make out a few more passages with careful examination under good light. The writer, presumably Lieutenant Samuel Winters, had clearly been aware of the danger his farm was in, positioned as it was along a strategic route. One partially legible entry read, "Orders to defend the payroll at all costs. Sarah insists we should not have accepted. Fears it makes us a target. She may be right." Another, dated April 3rd, 1863, was particularly poignant. "Confederate scouts spotted near Morgan's Ridge. If they attack in force, we cannot hold, have hidden the regimental pay, where only Sarah knows. If I fall, she will retrieve it when safe." Except Sarah never had retrieved it. Instead, according to Bill Harmon's book, she had lived out her days as a recluse, speaking of a curse on the blood money that had cost her husband his life. As Ethan pondered these fragments of a lifelong past, he was struck by the parallels to his own situation. Like Samuel Winters, he had lost everything he'd built. Like Sarah after her husband's death, he found himself alone in this house, facing an uncertain future. The difference was that Ethan had found what Sarah had apparently deliberately left, hidden, a decision that seemed to have haunted her for decades. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Riverside Farm precisely at 7 a.m., carrying what serviceable tools he'd managed to salvage from the Winters barn. Jim Mercer nodded approvingly at his punctuality and led him to the damaged barn. The job was straightforward, but physically demanding. The cracked support beam was a massive oak timber, over a foot square and 20 feet long. Replacing it would require careful temporary support of the structure, removal of the damaged beam, and installation of the new one that Mercer had already sourced from a local sawmill. Ethan worked methodically, falling easily into the familiar rhythms of construction. By midday, he had erected the temporary supports and begun the delicate process of extracting the damaged beam without destabilizing the barn roof. Mercer checked on his progress occasionally, saying little but watching with the critical eye of someone who knew quality work when he saw it. Late in the afternoon, as Ethan was preparing to finish for the day, a black SUV pulled into the farm's driveway. Daniel Garrett emerged, dressed impeccably as before, but now in clothing more suited to a rural setting, though his Italian leather boots had clearly never seen actual farm work. Mercer's expression darkened at the sight of their visitor. "Damn vultures back," he muttered to Ethan. "Keep working, I'll handle this." From his position in the barn, Ethan could hear portions of the conversation between the two men. Garrett was apparently making another offer on Riverside Farm. "Final offer" and "very generous" were phrases that carried clearly to where Ethan worked. Mercer's responses were equally clear, though considerably less polite, culminating in a suggestion about where Garrett could store his checkbook that made Ethan wince. As Garrett turned to leave, his gaze locked with Ethan's across the farmyard. Recognition flashed in his eyes, followed by something harder to define. Calculation, perhaps. He altered his course and approached the barn. "Mr. Caldwell," he called, his tone friendly but his eyes sharp. "I didn't expect to find you here. Having trouble with your new acquisition already?" "Just earning some honest pay," Ethan replied evenly, continuing his work. "Old-fashioned concept, I know." Garrett laughed, though the sound held little humor. "Indeed, though I'm surprised you're investing in someone else's property when your own is in such a dire condition." He glanced around to ensure Mercer wasn't within earshot. "My offer still stands. $3,000. Clean break, no complications." "I'm not interested in selling," Ethan said firmly. "No?" Garrett studied him carefully. "You know, I've been doing some research on you, Mr. Caldwell, former contractor. Business collapsed under fraud allegations, divorce, bankruptcy. You're a long way from Charlotte." The casual recitation of Ethan's personal disasters sent a chill through him. "You've been busy." "I like to know who I'm dealing with," Garrett said with a shrug, "and I'm wondering why a man in your position would turn down a chance to double his money overnight. Unless—" he paused significantly. "Unless you've found something on that property that makes it more valuable than it appears." Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "Just trying to rebuild my life. The farm gives me a chance to do that." "Does it?" Garrett's smile never reached his eyes. "Well, I admire your pioneer spirit, but that land will be part of Garrett Creek Resort eventually. It's just a question of when and how much it costs me." He turned to leave, then added, "By the way, I noticed some interesting activity at the old well on your property yesterday. You might want to be careful around those old structures. They can be unstable." With that parting shot, Garrett returned to his SUV and drove away, leaving Ethan with the cold certainty that he had been the one who left those tire tracks. More disturbing was the implication that Garrett had been watching the property enough to notice Ethan's work around the well. As Ethan finished his day's labor and collected his $150 from Mercer, a new urgency gripped him. Garrett suspected something. If he hadn't already seen Ethan unearth the box, the gold needed to be better secured immediately, and Ethan needed to determine his legal position before Garrett made his next move. Driving back to the farm, a plan began to form. If Garrett wanted the land because it was the missing piece in his resort development, then perhaps the gold wasn't the only valuable thing Ethan possessed. The farm's strategic location might give him leverage, assuming he could navigate the legal complexities of his discovery and fend off whatever pressure Garrett decided to apply next. One thing was certain: the relatively simple moral question of what to do with discovered historical artifacts had just become considerably more complicated by the very modern forces of greed, power, and ambition embodied in Daniel Garrett. Darkness had fallen by the time Ethan returned to the Winters farm. The old house loomed as a black silhouette against the night sky, its broken windows like vacant eyes watching his approach. After Garrett's thinly veiled threat, the isolated property felt suddenly vulnerable. Ethan's first priority was checking on the gold. He rushed to his makeshift bedroom, heart pounding until he confirmed the floorboard remained undisturbed and the metal box with its valuable contents was still safely hidden. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. This hiding place wouldn't suffice, not with Garrett clearly suspicious and potentially watching the property. Using his phone's flashlight, Ethan explored the farmhouse more thoroughly, searching for a better concealment option. In the kitchen, he discovered that the massive stone hearth had a loose brick at the back. Behind it was a small cavity, not large enough for the entire box, but sufficient for the coins themselves if wrapped properly. Working quickly, Ethan transferred the gold coins into a clean handkerchief, wrapped them securely, and placed them in the cavity before replacing the brick. The empty box and damaged diary, he returned to their original hiding place beneath the floorboard. If someone did search the house, they might find the box but not its valuable contents. That immediate concern addressed, Ethan sat by the fireplace, warming himself against the autumn chill while considering his situation. The day's revelations had changed everything. Garrett wasn't just a developer making opportunistic offers. He was actively investigating both Ethan and the property, and clearly suspected the land held some hidden value. Equally troubling was the historical context of his discovery. The seize. Gold coins represented Union Army payroll that Lieutenant Winters had died protecting. His widow, Sarah, had deliberately left it hidden, speaking of a curse on the blood money rather than using it herself, despite decades of presumed hardship as a widow in post-Civil War rural Tennessee. Was there a moral obligation to honor Sarah's apparent wishes? Did the federal government have a claim to what had technically been military funds? And how would any of this affect his legal right to the discovery as the property owner? Morning brought new complications. As Ethan prepared to return to his job at Riverside Farm, a sheriff's department SUV pulled into his driveway. A middle-aged officer with a weathered face and the name Carson on his badge approached the house. "Mr. Caldwell?" he called, standing at the bottom of the porch steps. "That's right," Ethan replied, tension evident in his stance. "Sheriff Carson, just doing a welfare check. We like to make sure newcomers are settling in okay, especially in remote properties like this." His tone was friendly, but his eyes were evaluating everything: the condition of the house, Ethan's appearance, the general state of the property. "I appreciate the concern," Ethan said carefully. "Still getting the place in order, as you can see." Sheriff Carson nodded. "Bill Harmon mentioned you'd purchased the old Winters place. Tough project you've taken on here." He glanced toward the fire. "Well then, back at Ethan. Found anything interesting while getting settled?" The pointed question confirmed Ethan's suspicions. This wasn't a routine visit, just the usual challenges of an abandoned property. Ethan replied non-committally. "Lot of repairs needed, but the structure's basically sound." Sheriff Carson seemed to weigh his response. "Mr. Caldwell, I should inform you that if you discover any items of historical significance on this property, county ordinance requires reporting such findings to the Historical Society for documentation." "I'll keep that in mind," Ethan said, maintaining a neutral expression. "Any particular reason you're mentioning this now?" The sheriff shrugged. "Just doing my job. We've had issues with artifact hunters and metal detectorists trespassing on historical properties. Civil War sites attract that sort of attention." After a few more minutes of superficial conversation, Carson departed with a final meaningful glance toward the well. Ethan watched the sheriff's vehicle disappear down the driveway, his unease growing. First Garrett, now the sheriff. Too much attention was focusing on his discovery. At Riverside Farm, Ethan threw himself into his work, grateful for the physical labor that temporarily distracted him from his mounting concerns. Jim Mercer seemed pleased with his progress on the barn repairs, and by mid-afternoon they had successfully installed the new support beam. As they took a water break, Mercer mentioned casually, "Saw Carson visit your place this morning." Ethan nodded, unsurprised that the news had already traveled. "Sheriff's a decent sort," Mercer continued, "but he and Garrett go way back, golf buddies, business associates too, from what I hear." The implication was clear. If Garrett suspected something valuable on the Winters farm, the sheriff's routine visit was anything but routine. "Thanks for the heads up," Ethan said. "Processing this new information." Mercer gave him a long look. "Whatever you're involved in, be careful. Garrett doesn't like losing, and he's got half the county council in his pocket." He hesitated, then added, "But he doesn't have everybody. Some of us old-timers still remember what this place was like before developers started carving it up." By the time Ethan returned to the farm that evening, one thing had become abundantly clear. He needed expert advice on both the historical and legal aspects of his discovery, and he needed it quickly. Before Garrett's suspicions turned into more direct action. With $300 in cash from his first 2 days of work at Riverside Farm, Ethan drove to Morrisville early the next morning. His first stop was the county library, where public computers offered internet access, a crucial resource now that his phone battery was again depleted with no reliable way to charge it at the farmhouse. The library was a modest brick building, but its resources proved invaluable. Ethan spent 2 hours researching the legal aspects of his discovery. What he found was complex and often contradictory. Different states had varying laws regarding treasure trove discoveries. Historical artifacts of national significance could be subject to federal claims. Civil War-era military property presented particularly murky legal territory. His research indicated that as the landowner, he likely had some claim to the discovery, but the situation wasn't straightforward. The historical nature of the coins and their apparent origin as military payroll complicated matters considerably. Next, Ethan looked into coin dealers and historical experts within driving distance. He found a promising lead in Marcus Jenkins, a retired history professor and certified coin appraiser in Knoxville, about an hour's drive away. Jenkins specialized in Civil War-era artifacts and had written several books on Tennessee's role in the conflict. Using the library phone, Ethan called and managed to schedule an appointment for the following day. He explained he had found potentially significant Civil War artifacts and needed expert assessment without going into specifics over the phone. His final stop in Morrisville was a hardware store where he purchased essential supplies: a tarp for the roof, basic plumbing materials to create a rainwater collection system, some tools to replace the rusted ones from the barn, and a solar-powered battery charger for his phone. The purchases consumed most of his earnings, but they were necessary investments if he planned to make the farm habitable. As Ethan loaded his purchases into his truck, he noticed a familiar black SUV parked across the street. Though he saw no sign of Garrett himself, the vehicle's presence confirmed his suspicion that he was being watched. Returning to the farm, Ethan set to work implementing basic improvements. He installed the tarp over the worst section of roof leak, set up a rudimentary rainwater collection system using gutters and barrels, and reinforced the door with a new deadbolt he'd purchased. A symbolic gesture of security at best, but it made him feel marginally better. That evening, Ethan carefully retrieved one gold coin from its hiding place in the hearth. He wrapped it securely and placed it in his pocket. He would take just this one coin to Professor Jenkins tomorrow, enough to get an expert opinion without risking his entire find. As night fell, Ethan sat by the fireplace, reading Bill Harmon's local history book more carefully. One passage caught his attention. Following the skirmish at the Winters farm, Union reinforcements had recovered the bodies of their fallen comrades, including Lieutenant Winters. His widow Sarah had received an official letter of condolence, but no pension, as her husband had been a civilian volunteer, guiding the Union troops rather than an enlisted soldier. This detail added another dimension to the story. The hidden gold represented not just military payroll, but perhaps the only financial security Sarah Winters might have claimed after her husband's death. Yet she had chosen to leave it buried, speaking of it as cursed. As Ethan drifted off to sleep that night, the moral weight of his discovery felt heavier than ever. Tomorrow, he hoped, would bring clarity, or at least expert insight into his increasingly complicated situation. The drive to Knoxville the following morning gave Ethan time to organize his thoughts. He had the single gold coin secured in his pocket, photos of the entire collection on his phone, and a list of questions for Professor Jenkins. The appointment was scheduled for 11 a.m. at the professor's home office, which apparently doubled as a private museum of Civil War artifacts. Marcus Jenkins lived in a Victorian house in a historic Knoxville neighborhood. The well-maintained property, with its meticulous garden and National Historic Register plaque by the door, spoke of someone who valued preservation and history. Ethan was greeted at the door by a spry man in his 70s with silver hair and alert blue eyes magnified by wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mr. Caldwell, I presume," the professor said, extending his hand. Come in, come in. My consultation room is just through here." The consultation room proved to be a converted library filled with glass display cases containing Civil War artifacts, uniforms, weapons, documents, and most relevantly, currency. Jenkins motioned Ethan to a seat at a large oak table, equipped with specialized lighting and examination tools. "Now then, you mentioned Civil War artifacts discovered on your property," Jenkins began. "What exactly have you brought me today?" Ethan carefully unwrapped the single gold coin and placed it on the table. Jenkins' eyebrows rose sharply as he reached for a pair of white cotton gloves and a magnifying loupe. "May I?" he asked, already reaching for the coin. For several minutes, the professor examined the double eagle in silence, turning it carefully, checking specific details through his loupe, and occasionally making notes. Finally, he looked up, his expression a mixture of academic excitement and caution. "This is an 1857 double eagle from the New Orleans Mint," he stated. "Condition is remarkable. I'd grade it at least AU 55, possibly better. Where exactly did you find this?" Ethan explained the circumstances of his discovery, showing Jenkins photos of the other coins and the fragmentary diary. The professor listened intently, his expression growing increasingly serious. "Mr. Caldwell, you've made a significant historical discovery," he said finally. "Based on the diary fragments and the dates of these coins, this almost certainly represents Union payroll from early 1863, likely the 27th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, which was operating in that region during that period." "What's it worth?" Ethan asked directly. Jenkins removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. "Monetarily, this single coin, given its condition and mint mark, would fetch $5,000 to $8,000 at auction. The entire collection, based on your photos, could easily exceed $200,000, particularly if properly authenticated and marketed to collectors. Possibly much more." The figure exceeded even Ethan's optimistic estimates. His relief must have shown on his face because Jenkins raised a cautionary hand. "However, the historical significance complicates matters considerably. This isn't simply a finders-keepers situation. That's why I'm here," Ethan acknowledged. "What are my legal obligations?" "Complex," Jenkins sighed. "As the property owner, you have certain rights to discoveries on your land. However, military payroll technically remains government property, even after 150 years. There's also the historical significance to consider. These coins and the diary represent a previously undocumented episode in Tennessee's Civil War history." The professor leaned forward. "But there's something else that concerns me. You mentioned Daniel Garrett has been pressuring you to sell the property." Ethan nodded, surprised at the professor's reaction to Garrett's name. "I know Garrett," Jenkins said, his voice hardening. "He's been acquiring Civil War sites throughout eastern Tennessee, developing them into resorts while paying lip service to preservation. His company donated to our department, expecting favorable historical assessments in return." The old man's face flushed with indignation. "I refused to compromise academic integrity. My early retirement followed shortly after." This revelation cast Garrett's interest in the Winters farm in a new light. It wasn't just about completing his land assemblage for a resort. He might have known about the rumored gold all along. "What do you recommend I do?" Ethan asked. "Document everything meticulously," Jenkins advised. "I can help authenticate the collection properly. Then you have options, from private sale to museums to voluntary surrender to the government. Each has different implications." He paused. "But whatever you do, be careful. Daniel Garrett plays by his own rules, and historical preservation is not his priority." Driving back to Harmon's Creek, Ethan's mind churned with Professor Jenkins's revelations. The coins were even more valuable than he'd initially thought, potentially life-changing money. Yet the web of ethical, historical, and legal considerations had only grown more complex. Jenkins had agreed to prepare formal documentation of the collection, but had cautioned Ethan against making any public announcements about his discovery until he decided on a course of action. "Once word gets out officially," the professor had warned, "many parties will stake claims. The federal government, historical societies, possibly even descendants of the original regiment." As the rural landscape rolled by outside his truck window, Ethan weighed his options. He could sell the coins privately and quickly. Jenkins had discreetly mentioned several collectors who would pay premium prices with minimal questions asked. This would give Ethan immediate financial security, but might be legally questionable. He could donate the collection to a museum in exchange for a tax write-off, a morally admirable choice, but one that wouldn't solve his immediate financial needs and would still attract attention to his discovery. He could report the find to federal authorities and hope for a finder's fee, the most legally sound approach, but one that would likely result in the longest process with the least financial benefit. Or he could follow Sarah Winter's example and rebury the coins, honoring her apparent wish that the blood money remain hidden. But that option felt increasingly impractical with Garrett watching the property and the sheriff already suspicious. By the time Ethan pulled into his driveway at the farm, the decision crystallized in his mind. The moral weight of this discovery wasn't just about the gold itself, but about the land it had been found on, land that Garrett intended to develop, erasing its historical significance. Lieutenant Winters had died protecting this payroll. His widow had chosen to leave it buried rather than profit from what she viewed as blood money. The farm itself was a piece of Civil War history, one of many such sites Garrett had been systematically acquiring and transforming into resorts. Ethan entered the farmhouse and checked the hiding place in the hearth. The coins remained undisturbed. Sitting by the fireplace, he carefully read through Bill Harmon's local history book again, particularly the sections about the Winters family and the farm's role in the Civil War. An idea began to form, one that could potentially preserve the historical significance of the property, secure Ethan's financial future, and thwart Garrett's development plans. It wouldn't be simple, and it carried risks, but it felt right in a way that none of his other options did. The next morning, Ethan made 2 phone calls from the general store. The first was to Professor Jenkins, outlining his plan and requesting specific historical documentation. The second was to Daniel Garrett, accepting his invitation to discuss the property, but on Ethan's terms, at the farm 2 days from now. The die was cast. Ethan had made his decision for better or worse. Now he had to prepare for the confrontation that would determine not just his future, but the legacy of the Winters farm and its long-hidden secret. The next 48 hours passed in a flurry of activity as Ethan prepared for his meeting with Garrett. By day, he continued working at Riverside Farm, earning the cash he needed while establishing himself as a reliable worker in the community. By night, he worked on his own property, cleaning up the most presentable room in the farmhouse for the upcoming meeting and refining the details of his plan. Professor Jenkins had been enthusiastic about Ethan's proposal, promising to expedite the historical documentation and make several key phone calls on his behalf. "It's an elegant solution," the professor had said. "Rather poetic, actually, given the property's history." On the morning of the meeting, Ethan received a package via courier. Jenkins had come through with the promised documentation, along with letters of support from several historical preservation organizations. The final piece of his strategy was now in place. At precisely 2 p.m., a black SUV pulled up the driveway. Daniel Garrett emerged, accompanied by a man in a suit carrying a briefcase who was introduced as "My attorney, Mr. Hoffman." Sheriff Carson arrived moments later in his department vehicle, his presence unexpected, but not entirely surprising, given his connection to Garrett. "Quite the welcoming committee," Ethan remarked dryly as he ushered the 3 men into the cleared and cleaned front room of the farmhouse. A folding table had been set up with chairs borrowed from Riverside Farm, just ensuring everything's above board. Garrett replied smoothly, though his eyes darted around the room assessingly. "I'm prepared to make a significantly improved offer. On the property, $5,000 cash." He nodded to his attorney, who opened the briefcase to reveal neatly stacked bills. "Impressive," Ethan said, deliberately unimpressed. But before we discuss your offer, I'd like to clarify something. You've been interested in this property since before the auction, yet you stopped bidding at $200. Why? Garrett's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. Simply a business decision. Every property has a maximum value in my calculations. And yet, here you are, offering more than twice what you were willing to bid at auction. Ethan pressed. What changed? Let's cut to the chase, Caldwell, Garrett said, his facade of friendliness slipping. We both know you found something on this property. Gold, if my sources are correct. Civil War-era coins. Quite valuable. Sheriff Carson shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. You're right, Ethan said simply, surprising all three men with his candor. I did find something. He reached into his pocket and removed a small cloth bundle, placing it on the table and carefully unwrapping it to reveal one of the double eagle coins. Garrett's eyes gleamed with naked avarice. I thought so. Now let's be reasonable. Whatever you found belongs rightfully to the property. I'm prepared to be generous in my purchase offer. Ethan smiled. Actually, I've already made arrangements for the coins. But I do have a counteroffer for you regarding the property itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.